Well, good evening, and welcome back to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. It's Nancy Miller here, the creator of the podcast. And if you happen to be new to the podcast, well, Dead Sleep is a true crime podcast made for nighttime listening. Which means, if you find a lot of other true crime shows a little too loud, a little too violent, with far too many obnoxious ads, well, Dead Sleep might be for you. And thank you to everyone who listens to the show, because thanks to you, Dead Sleep is the only independent, ad-free true crime podcast currently in the top 100 podcasts on Apple, recently reaching number 85 in the true crime category. I think that's wonderful. If you would like to support this podcast, you can do so via Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Patreon. Now, as we settle in and get comfortable, I thought it might help to burn off a little busy brain energy with a vocabulary lesson. 2 words, and those words are famous and infamous. Those 2 words may sound similar, but they have 2 distinct meanings. The word famous, that means well-known. But infamous, that means having a reputation of the worst kind, notoriously evil. For 50 years, right up until the day she died in May of 2026, a woman named Claudine Longet was both. Claudine Longet was famous in the 1960s as a French singer and film star. She was revered for her breathy, childlike singing style, a style that was very popular in France in the 1960s called yé-yé. Unlike the other big French stars like France Gall, Jane Birkin, Brigitte Bardot, she sang mostly cover songs in English with a heavy French accent. The result sounding like a cross between Charlotte Gainsbourg and Elmer Fudd. To give you an idea, here's a few seconds of Claudine singing The Carpenters' We've Only Just Begun.
We've only just begun to live. White lace and promises.
Her whole image was like something out of Amélie, a little French girl, a woman child you instinctively wanted to protect. Which is why what happened in the life of Claudine Longet in the 1970s was such a shock. In the spring of 1976, Claudine Longet was accused of murder. She was implicated in the shooting death of her boyfriend, a professional skier named Spider Sabich. Claudine said it was an accident. Everyone else said it was murder. And the details around the incident, they are still murky some 50 years later. But one thing is clear. Claudine's criminal case was one of the first high-profile celebrity trials with a glamorous star as the defendant. There was a global fascination around Claudine's case, a level of obsessive scrutiny about what she wore, how she looked, as an indication of her guilt or innocence. It was an early look at the type of coverage in the future felony trials of the famous and infamous in the 1990s, from Betty Broderick to Jennifer Lopez to Winona Ryder. And that was just the beginning. When I came across her obituary, I knew Claudine Longer's name. I knew the essential facts around this vintage saga. I even knew and enjoyed her music. But I never really knew Claudine's side of the story. It turns out very few people do. Because for 50 years, Claudine stayed quiet. She never spoke publicly about Spider's death, never gave an interview, and the most tantalizing source material, a diary she kept around that time, was apparently so juicy, Claudine burned the journal to ensure its destruction. However, there was a time when Claudine Longer planned to publish a memoir. And the reason why she didn't, why she couldn't, is actually the most enduring detail in Claudine's story. It was one of the earliest battles of a victim's rights versus the right to free speech. A struggle for control over who gets to tell their story and, more important, who gets to profit off of that story. And the notion of notoriety for profit, better known to many as the Son of Sam law, it remains a controversial issue some 50 years later. Most recently, with the high-profile cases of Karen Reed and the teenaged car crash killer, Mackenzie Shirilla. But before we exhaust ourselves with all of that, let's start in a quieter place, a tranquil place, a cozy place, a luxury mid-century ski chalet in Aspen, Colorado, with a pristine view of the Rocky Mountains. Early in the morning of March 21st, 1976, a surprise snowfall gently blanketed the Aspen area with fresh powder. White, fluffy flakes that would turn early spring into a winter wonderland. And then around 4:30, all of that blissful calm abruptly stopped with the sound of a single pop. "20 minutes later, an ambulance screeched up to the security guard at the Starwood, the first and maybe only gated community in the area, located just outside of Aspen. Back in 1976, the Starwood's most famous resident was John Denver, who single-handedly put the whole region on the map with his 1974 hit song, Rocky Mountain High. Now, 2 years later, the hard-partying resort town was about to hit rock bottom. One of Aspen's most beloved locals, a professional skier named Spider Savage, had been shot. Just after 5 o'clock, the ambulance pulled up to Spider's house, a groovy 3-bedroom bachelor pad, as rugged and handsome as the man himself. The paramedic made his way through the house, passing through the living room that had a waterbed in the middle until he found Spider in the main bathroom, collapsed on the tile floor in his underwear. From afar, Spider looked like a toppled Greek statue, with shaggy, curly blonde hair and the sculpted physique of the Olympic champion he once was. At the scene, the paramedic took note. There was virtually no blood anywhere. Then he noticed a very small hole in Spider's abdomen, suggesting the bullet had gone into his body and stayed there, and nearly all of the bleeding was internal. Cradling Spider's head was his girlfriend, 34-year-old French entertainer Claudine Longer. There was a time when Claudine danced in Vegas wearing little more than a beaded bikini. But now, she wore the Aspen uniform, a pair of worn blue jeans and a flowy peasant blouse. Her shoulder-length brown hair long and loose. Her big brown eyes flooded with tears. She pleaded with the paramedic to save the life of the man she loved. The man she shot. No doubt, the authorities at the scene knew Claudine Longer. Throughout the 1960s, she'd starred in a Blake Edwards comedy. She'd released several chart-topping albums and appeared on television countless times, often alongside her husband, now her ex-husband, the legendary singer Andy Williams. Claudine was the rare French export who'd successfully forged a huge career in the States. Only now, as she sobbed hysterically, they couldn't help but wonder if this waterworks display was her greatest performance yet. Claudine told her convoluted story in a breathy, quaking, childlike voice. Her sentences a mix of French and English, though the police found the whole plot hard to follow. There would be different versions of the story, but the essential details were this. Earlier that afternoon, around 4:30, she happened upon an old gun. A German .22 caliber pistol. The gun once belonged to Spider's grandfather, who acquired it somewhere in France when he was a fighter pilot during World War II. Claudine said she picked it up, and she showed it to Spider, asking him how to use it. And somehow, the gun, it just went off. She didn't even realize he'd been shot until her precious Spider collapsed on the ground, and in what appeared to be his final moments, he said Claudine's name 3 times. Claudine, Claudine, Claudine. At least that's how she remembered it. Well, the story was like something straight out of Flaubert. But the police believed they could smell Claudine Longer's merde from a mile away. But they kept those suspicions to themselves as they took Spider away in the ambulance, and Claudine followed, jumping into the back. But they simply couldn't get there in time. Spider Savage died en route to the hospital, March 21st, 1976. He was 31 years old. The news of Spider Savage's death was devastating. Maybe back in Hollywood, Claudine Longer was a celebrity, but here in Aspen, Colorado, Spider was the star. Born Vladimir Peter Savage Jr. in California, he earned the nickname Spider due to the spindly arms and legs he had as a baby. Long, lean limbs that would later serve him as an alpine racer who attended the University of Colorado on a ski scholarship. Then competed as a member of the U.S. ski team in the 1968 Winter Olympics in Grenoble, France, coming in 5th in the slalom race. The Grenoble Games were the first Olympics broadcast in color, which only enhanced Spider's image. The blonde, blue-eyed bad boy with the big grin was certainly telegenic. Even Robert Redford was a fan. In the late 1960s, to prepare for a lead role in a sports drama called Downhill Racer, Redford drew inspiration for his character from the charismatic cool of Spider Savage. The key to Spider's cool was his boyish charm. Spider always joked that he never wanted to grow up, how he was the Peter Pan of Aspen, a town that was itself a snow-covered microcosm of the movie Logan's Run. In that old sci-fi movie, which would be released later that summer of 1976, everyone lives in a dystopian future where the world is so overpopulated, no one is allowed to grow old, and you are terminated on your 30th birthday. In Aspen, it appeared the termination date was closer to 40, because everywhere you looked, everyone was young. Even their high-level officials were young. One of the prosecutors who would be working on this case, he was only 26 years old. And this aura of youth was especially true in the life of Spider Savage, who enjoyed the constant churn of carefree 20-somethings in awe of the Olympic champion. Which was why everyone was so surprised when Spider took up with Claudine. By then, she was in her mid-30s, with 3 school-aged children from her previous marriage. Perhaps Spider was attracted to Claudine's independence. She was accomplished in her own right, with her own career and her own money. This included a sizable settlement from her divorce, essentially ensuring Claudine wouldn't have to lean on Spider for anything but companionship. And Claudine said as much to the police, claiming they had a wonderful relationship. Why would she ever shoot Spider on purpose? But the locals, who were either fans or friends or both of Spider Savage, they claimed otherwise. There were rumors that Spider had told a couple of friends he wanted to end things with Claudine. She was jealous and always nagging at him. By then, Claudine and her 3 children essentially lived with Spider. Word was, he told Claudine she needed to move out by April 1st. Days later, he was dead. Everyone in Aspen was so convinced Claudine killed Spider. They were outraged when she turned up at his memorial service 6 days after the incident. Claudine appeared camera-ready, dressed in a Jackie O-style black ensemble. As she made her way towards his shrine, she plucked a single daisy from a nearby flower arrangement and held it close to her chest, tears splashing on the petals. Seemingly unaware that nearly everyone at this service despised her, and they watched her, stone-faced and silent, each one plotting their revenge. Everyone in Aspen knew the town had its own form of justice, the kind that didn't come from a courthouse. There were even rumors that someone had put a hit out on Claudine. So maybe Claudine should have considered herself lucky when on April 7th, 1976, she was formally charged with felony manslaughter. In court that day, she was told she could face up to 60 years in prison. Claudine's only ally had to be flown in from Los Angeles. Her ex-husband, Andy Williams, who helped Claudine secure a criminal defense attorney in Colorado and flew in from California to show his support, holding her hand during her arraignment. Claudine pleaded not guilty. Even though they weren't together anymore, Andy felt protective over Claudine. After all, he was the one who plucked her from showgirl obscurity back in Vegas in 1960, when she was an 18-year-old dancer at the Tropicana, where Andy performed. Claudine did not speak a word of English. Andy did not speak a word of French. But when they went on their first date, they connected. Andy fell head over heels in love with Claudine. And when she went back to Paris, where she was from, Andy followed her, determined to win her heart. In his memoir, Andy Williams described how he could not live without Claudine. It was like something out of 19th century France, like Colette's Gigi. When a wealthier, older man of high status fell in love with a younger, beautiful, but lower status woman known as a demi-mondaine. Back in the 19th century, these women who were part of the demi-monde, which means half-world, they lived along the fringes of what was considered respectable society. Dancers, singers, actresses, known for their wit, their style, their charm, their beauty, and their power over men. Especially wealthy, powerful men who dedicated themselves to taking care of the demi-mondaine. These women influenced fashion, society, and art, inspiring the painters of some of our greatest masterpieces, including Toulouse-Lautrec and Edouard Manet. They were part muse, part socialite, part influencer, and even patrons of the arts themselves. And if these women were smart with their money, they could amass sizable fortunes, independent wealth, by the age of 35. Of course, that was in the 1860s. This was the 1960s. Things had changed. Andy Williams planned to marry Claudine Longet, but the arrangement was something similar. He was a 32-year-old man marrying an 18-year-old girl, and he promised her parents, no matter what, he would take care of her. And throughout their marriage, he took care of Claudine and her family. When Claudine's sister back in Paris was in an unhappy and abusive marriage, he arranged for Claudine's sister to escape, spiriting her sister away in his private jet so she wouldn't have to go back to her abusive husband. And for a while, everything was perfect. Until it seems success got in the way. By the late 1960s, both Claudine and Andy were at the peak of their careers. As a singer and actress, Claudine was enjoying enormous influence over popular culture. And it seemed the two drifted apart. And apparently each one sought companionship outside of the marriage. Which, by the way, for a while anyway, both Claudine and Andy were fine with. They were best friends. They would just stay married and have their dalliances on the side. And it seemed to work until Andy would say, "Along came Spider." Initially, Claudine and Spider, who met on a ski trip in California, they were just having fun. Claudine would fly to Aspen on the weekends. Then, it wasn't just weekends in Aspen. She was there for the whole week. Then for several weeks, months. One day, Claudine told Andy that things with Spider were serious. It seemed he wanted to marry her. So she was going to pack up and move to Aspen with the children full time. Andy said he wouldn't contest the divorce, and ultimately, he gave her a generous settlement and his blessing. Which was why Andy didn't believe any of the accusations against Claudine. She loved Spider. She left Andy for Spider. And while he would concede she had a fiery temper, that was common among the French, but she was not a murderer. And he made that promise to her parents all those years ago that he would stand by her and support her, and he wasn't going to stop now. The trial was set for January of 1977, which gave Aspen police, who had very little experience dealing with homicide, it gave them roughly 9 months to get it together and build their case. Initially, they didn't have that much. Their only real witness was Claudine's 12-year-old daughter, Noelle. Her 2 sons were out sledding at the time of the shooting. Noelle told authorities she didn't see what happened, but she could confirm she heard Spider say her mother's name a couple of times. Then she saw her mother pick up the phone and call the police. Surprisingly, the gun, their so-called murder weapon, wasn't the best evidence either. The pistol was an old German relic with a broken safety, which meant the gun could have gone off accidentally. So how would they prove otherwise? Working backwards, they revisited Spider's fatal wound, that small bullet hole that plugged him just below the rib cage and lodged into his internal organs. Claudine claimed she'd held the gun with an open hand, resting the gun on her palm like a tray. In her scenario, she would have stood close to Spider, a matter of a few inches, before the gun got jostled somehow and went off. But according to their ballistic evidence, it seemed more likely the gun was fired at a greater distance, somewhere between 4 to 6 feet, a little less than 2 meters, a distance that suggested Claudine walked into the bathroom with the gun, pointed it at Spider, and fired. The question now was why? Why would she do that? By Claudine's account, the couple got along great. There were no problems with the relationship. At least, that's what Claudine said. What she wrote was an entirely different story. For nearly 20 years, Claudine Lange's image was of a fragile little French girl in need of male protection. But the diary recovered at the home she shared with her now slain lover showed a different side. A wildly jealous and vicious woman, consumed with rage that filled each page. At least that's what police said. They'd seized Claudine's diary when they first searched the house the day Spider was killed, that March of 1976. Prosecutors claimed this diary proved she was obsessed with Spider and terrified of losing him. He'd told her they were through. And voila, these pages offered a motive, one of the oldest in the book: jealousy. This was a crime of passion. And when he started seeing other women, she started looking for a murder weapon. There was even recent evidence of Spider's infidelity. A clue as clear as day. The morning of March 21st, after that fresh, powdery snow fell, Claudine and Spider both went skiing. But on separate mountains. And the peaks they chose reflected just how far downhill their relationship had gone. That morning, Claudine, she skied Ajax Mountain. Claudine wasn't a professional, but she was an experienced and accomplished skier. Ajax was steep and fast, for advanced skiers only. Spider, however, skied Buttermilk. Buttermilk Mountain was the bunny slope, with gently rolling hills. A terrible place for an expert skier. But the perfect place to take someone who's learning how to ski. Like, say, a young waitress that you might have gone out with the night before. A girl who was perhaps new in town, and you wanted to show her the slopes. Later that afternoon, locals said they saw Claudine at a popular bar, drinking a few too many glasses of wine, then revealing to a friend that Spider was finished with her, wondering what, if anything, she could do about it. Spider, he was also throwing a few back. After his run at Buttermilk, he went to a wealthy friend's chalet, and it was there, at least his friend said, Spider confided that he was done with Claudine, and he couldn't wait for her to move out, and he'd mentioned that due date of April 1st. At some point just before 4 o'clock, Spider came home to change his clothes, and he planned to go back to the party. But police believed once he came home, he encountered a very drunk and very angry Claudine. She confronted Spider as he was getting dressed. She targeted him while he was vulnerable, in his underwear, near the shower. Maybe she aimed it right at him. Maybe she tried to scare him. Maybe she pretended she was joking around. But the final result was the same. Spider sprawled on the floor, clinging to life. So they had the gun, the diary, and when they first questioned Claudine the day Spider died, they took a blood sample. And prosecutors said that blood sample came back positive for both alcohol and cocaine. Now, to be fair to Claudine, in Aspen in the 1970s, cocaine was everyone's second favorite kind of powder. Newsweek even dubbed Aspen the cocaine capital of the United States around that time. So if she had partied with it, she certainly wasn't alone. But under these harsh circumstances, this kind of evidence was pretty damning. None of it directly pointed to Claudine shooting Spider, but it suggested that Claudine had a dark side, one that few people ever saw. One that was possessive, angry, jealous, and dangerous. As the trial date drew closer, one of the prosecutors, who was in his 20s, crowed to the press about their evidence. They had no doubt she would be found guilty of reckless manslaughter, defined as consciously disregarding a substantial and unjustifiable risk. If convicted, she could spend 10 years in prison. Then Claudine and her team got a break. Just before the trial, the judge ruled the prosecution's most important pieces of evidence, that is, the journal and the blood sample, they were inadmissible. It seems the youth and inexperience of the authorities showed. First, they searched the entire house, acquiring that journal without a warrant. Second, there was an issue around the blood sample. The toxicology report, it wouldn't matter, because the judge ruled the blood sample was taken from her before she was Mirandized, before she was formally charged, and therefore it was inadmissible. This was all great news for Claudine's case, but there was one significant issue they couldn't do much about: the jury. Aspen was a small town, a few thousand people in the off-season, and nearly everyone in town was on Spider's side and convinced Claudine killed him, practically in cold blood. And many people were furious she wasn't charged with murder. And there were those who were more than willing to try and get themselves on the jury just so they could find Claudine Longet guilty and send her away for as long as possible. Her lawyers likely hoped they could change the location. A different venue could mean a different outcome. If only they could have changed the venue from Aspen, Colorado to Paris, France. And in Paris, Claudine wouldn't necessarily be the villain. If history was any indication, she would be the victim. Back in the 19th century, around the time of the demi-monde, there were hundreds of women who went on trial for murdering or attempting to murder their cheating husbands or ex-lovers. And the majority of the time, like 99.9%, these women were acquitted. It's worth noting that at that time, the law allowed a man to kill his wife should he discover her in the throes of passion with another man. But there was no such protection in the law for women. But for a woman who's been abandoned by her husband or dumped by a lover who promised to marry her, she had everything to lose: her financial security, her social standing, her future. And in these instances, these crimes of passion, the juries over and over again found these women not guilty. Now, of course, back then, only men could be on a jury. But women attended these trials in droves. It was an earlier form of true crime entertainment. And the women who attended, they got dressed in their finest clothing, and they sat in the galleries. And what they were waiting for were the two highlights, the most dramatic moments. The accused, that is, the betrayed woman, testifying and telling her story. And then the defense attorney's closing arguments that would drive people in the galleries to tears. And these closing arguments were pivotal to swaying both the jury and popular opinion. Now, 100 years later, in Aspen, Colorado, Claudine Longet was on the stand. And while she insisted she was innocent and that it was all an accident, the tactics her attorneys used were very similar to the kinds that were used a century earlier in her native country. Claudine was depicted as an angel. And on the stand, she was so small, so soft-spoken, so meek. It was hard for any jury to imagine that she could have done it. But just in case someone did think she did it, well, she had good reason. She was a woman betrayed. Spider had made a lot of promises, and, almost without warning, he reneged on them all, practically kicking her out of her own home, leaving her with nothing. That is, if she'd done it, which of course she had not. Now, the prosecutor's closing argument, it only ran 20 minutes, while the defense attorney, his closing arguments ran over an hour. And it was in his impassioned case for Claudine that many people suddenly found sympathy. Even Spider's own family was on Claudine's side. Yes, she'd made a mistake, but it was an accident. And they didn't want Claudine to go to prison. Think of what it would do to her children. So by the end of the trial, it was a toss-up. Nobody knew which way the jury would go. And in the end, it seems they kind of split the difference. Claudine was found guilty, not of reckless manslaughter, but of negligent homicide, essentially saying that she'd made a mistake, and that mistake allowed someone to die. And she was sentenced to just 30 days in jail, and the judge told her she could choose whatever times work for her. So Claudine chose to go to jail on the weekends. Claudine was apparently unhappy with this verdict. She insisted she was innocent. And this is part of the reason why she wanted to write her memoir, to tell her side of the story. But it was here Spider's family drew the line. Did they want her to go to prison for the rest of her life? No. But did they want her to have her side of the story immortalized in book form? Absolutely not. And so they sued Claudine in a civil case that was ultimately settled out of court. But part of the agreement meant a lifelong NDA. She was not allowed to speak about or write about what happened with Spider. And all of this happened in 1977, just before the creation of the Son of Sam Law. And you may broadly know about the Son of Sam Law and what it means, but in the specific case of David Berkowitz, who was Son of Sam, he was offered a book deal by a publishing company called McGraw-Hill, and they were offering Berkowitz $75,000 for the rights to his story. And it was in that offer and potential publishing deal, legislators became concerned about Berkowitz and others like him profiting off of their crimes. And so the Son of Sam Law doesn't stop someone from writing about their crime. The law was trying to prevent the person from making money off of that crime, legally diverting any profits into a specific fund for victims and their families. Now, as you likely know, the Supreme Court overturned the specific Son of Sam Law in New York State in 1991. And the Supreme Court at the time deemed the Son of Sam Law in New York State somehow over-inclusive and under-inclusive, like it reached too far but not far enough. And I'll link to it in the show notes so you can read the decision for yourself. But the outcome was victims and their families were not automatically going to get profits off of someone's book. And the apparent workaround in many of these situations is for the victims' families to file a civil suit and ensure they receive a restitution And those restitution amounts are massive, in the multi-millions of dollars, thereby ensuring that whatever is made off of someone's book deal, it will legally funnel into this restitution fund. The question now is what it looks like in the 21st century, when there are all kinds of new ways to profit off one's notoriety. And this came up recently in the infamous case of Mackenzie Shirilla, also known as the Hell on Wheels killer, the woman who, when she was a teenager, crashed her car intentionally and killed her boyfriend and his friend inside. Now, it's unlikely Mackenzie is going to put pen to paper and write an autobiography. But this high-profile case, along with her appearance on a Netflix documentary, has elevated Mackenzie's profile, adding to the audience she'd already cultivated as an influencer on Instagram, giving her potential opportunities to explore new revenue streams, even from prison, where she is currently serving 2 consecutive life sentences. And recently, the sister of one of the victims filed a Change.org petition calling on lawmakers in Ohio to create a modern, constitutionally sound law that prevents certain convicted violent offenders from turning crime-based notoriety into personal profit, perks, business opportunities, or indirect financial gain. And this petition continues to suggest a modernized law should require disclosure of monetized social media accounts, paid interviews, sponsorships, documentaries, podcasts, merchandise, affiliate links, online fundraisers, appearance fees, and business arrangements connected to crime-based notoriety. Essentially, this petition wants to prevent a new generation of crime influencers. And so far, this petition has generated nearly 200,000 signatures, with reports of Ohio lawmakers considering a bill. And I'm curious to find out what might happen with this bill, as I'm sure you are too. For anyone curious about what happened with Claudine Langer, well, for years, there were rumors around Aspen that she was this recluse, a woman living in exile. But that is not what happened. Claudine stayed out of the public eye, this is true, and she couldn't go to a restaurant anywhere in Aspen without fear of someone spitting in her food. But Claudine, it seems, got over the loss of Spider relatively quickly. She ended up marrying one of her defense attorneys, who left his wife and children to be with her. And once they were married, they continued to live in Aspen, where he bought the biggest house in the most exclusive neighborhood, at the highest peak of the biggest mountain. And that's where she stayed for the next half-century. And it must have been one hell of a view. Claudine Langer at the very top, looking down on the rest of the world. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey in the life of Claudine Langer. I hope I've done her justice. I'll be back at the end of July with the July bonus episode. I hope you subscribe so you don't miss it. Thank you, as always, for your support. Until next time, nighty-night.